This old Sony camera is a heap of junk. It's totally obsolete, but I will never get rid of it because it taught me, I think, the most valuable lesson I ever learned when it came to storytelling. I was in my early 20s when I started work in a BBC newsroom for the first time. Now, I was eager, I was bright, I was enthusiastic, but I was a massive liability for about 2 years because I didn't understand how television storytelling really worked. In fact, I didn't understand how storytelling really worked, full stop. So I would get excited about the kind of issues that I was writing about when I was an undergraduate because I was studying politics and history and I found that stuff interesting. So I would be going to my editors and saying, hey, we could do this story about regional development, or there's this interesting political discussion going on in this organisation. And my editors, who were very patient, they would say to me one really interesting, for me, killer question. And it was, okay, Steve, what would you point a camera at? Because remember, this is television. So what would you actually point your camera at in order to tell that story? If you're writing an article in a journal, you need one or two graphs and then a lot of 1,000 words of text. But if you're producing television, you need image after image after image, and you just can't do that with graphs. Then there was the political discussion going on over here in this council building somewhere. And again, the question, well, what would you point your camera at? Well, you could point your camera at people talking to each other in a council meeting. You could point your camera at, and this is what we ended up doing, kind of the council building. And in fact, there was a phrase for this in when you had no other pictures to go on, you ended up showing pictures of buildings saying, this company here has been committing fraud against its customers, and this council here made this unpopular decision, and all you were showing were buildings. So we used to call that guilty building syndrome. It was terrible TV. It was kind of television of the last resort, where you had no other pictures to use. You used pictures of buildings inside the High Court today, because you weren't allowed to take cameras into court and film the defendant and the judges and all that kind of thing. So you always had these shots of the outside of the court building. It's like, oh my word, it's incredibly boring TV. It's terrible storytelling as well. That question that my editors asked me, what would you point your camera at? And that one question forced me to think beyond the idea that I was trying to get across, beyond the text that I wanted to write, and it forced me to think about a visual story. And very quickly you realise that the most interesting thing to point a camera at are people doing things, not people saying things, but people doing things. That's way more interesting because it's more telling. How someone acts tells us more about them than what they say, because people can say anything, but what do they do? That's interesting. Who are you going to point your camera at? That was the really interesting question. So you want to talk about regional development. Okay, you need to find a company that's a growing startup in the city of Manchester and go and see what they do and watch them doing it, and then hear from them what their challenges are and what their aspirations are for the region that's growing around them. So you need to take that big idea and take it down to a little, for example, story that's something you can point your camera at. After about 5 years working in the BBC, something changed, technology changed, and we got these. Now, this is a Sony PD150. It's a digital camera. These were much, much cheaper than broadcast cameras. Therefore, we could afford more of them. Therefore, journalists like me were given a camera and told to go out and film our own stories. Suddenly, that kind of abstract question that my editor would ask me in a meeting, what are you going to point your camera at, became incredibly real, because on any given story, I had to learn what and who to point my camera at. Okay, so I spent many, many years learning these lessons about storytelling, and I'm going to give you now some shortcut wisdom to apply to your storytelling. Now, you may never go out with a camera and try and film a news report. Doesn't matter. If you're talking about your work, you should be telling stories. So here are 3 really valuable lessons that I can give you from my time as a BBC journalist. Lesson number 1, people tell stories about people. We don't tell stories about guilty buildings. We don't tell stories about things. We tell stories about people. You might think, well, actually, I've developed a thing. I've developed a product, I've developed technology, and I think this thing is fascinating, and all my engineers who I work with, they agree it's a fascinating thing. Okay, it's hard to tell stories about things, but behind every thing, there are at least 2 people who you can tell a story about. The first group of people are the people who made it. Yeah, the excitement of the development, the discovery, the invention. There's an inventor's story about the people who made the thing and why they made it. And then, of course, there's another story about the people who should be using the thing to make their lives better. Maybe you are selling things, but you can still find people stories to tell. Second lesson, remember the question my editors used to ask me, what are you going to point your camera at? You're using your mind's eye when you're telling stories. So describe a situation, a scene. Describe people doing something in that scene for a reason. And when you describe that in words in your story, I run a little movie in my head to understand the words you're saying. So actually, I'm pointing my mind's eye. My internal camera is pointing at the scene that you're describing. So going back to that question about grabbing someone's attention and holding their attention, you can't hold someone's attention if they can't see what you mean. And the final lesson is you've got to find something that people care about. This is why emotion is really important. Emotion is really important in news stories. And we'd often ask people as part of the interview, how did you feel when you discovered this thing happened? How do you feel now? That's really significant because we are emotional creatures. And so if you can tell a story where it's about people, I can see what you mean, and I know how that feels, well, you've made a really powerful connection to me, the listener. All of these insights, everything I learned in my time at the BBC, everything I've learned in the last 10 years working as a consultant, helping people like you tell better stories about their work, all of that has gone into the course called Stories That Sell. If you want to know more about that course, the link is in the description below. Take a look. I think you'll find it interesting.